The security footage would later be dissected frame by frame, analyzed by civil rights attorneys, and broadcast across every major news network in the country. But in that moment, as the marble floors of the First Metropolitan Bank lobby reflected the harsh, fluorescent lights overhead, all that mattered was the sound of designer heels scraping against polished stone as two uniformed men dragged a woman in a perfectly tailored Armani suit toward the revolving glass doors. Ava Langston's platinum watch caught the light as her wrist twisted against the grip of the taller officer. Her briefcase had fallen somewhere behind them, spilling legal documents across the pristine floor like scattered leaves. The few customers in the lobby stood frozen, their conversations dying mid-sentence as they witnessed something that would later be described as both shocking and, tragically, all too familiar. "This is a mistake." Ava's voice carried across the cavernous space, each word crisp and clear despite the chaos. "I have an appointment with your branch manager at 11:30. The shorter officer, his badge reading Patterson, tightened his grip on her arm. "Ma'am, you need to calm down and come with us. We've already explained that you don't have valid identification to be in this establishment." What Patterson didn't know, what neither of the HOA contracted security officers knew, was that the woman they were physically removing from the building was Dr. Ava Langston, founder and CEO of Nova Bank Financial Technologies, the revolutionary FinTech company that had just been valued at $12.7 billion. The same company that held the lease on the entire 42nd floor of the First Metropolitan Tower. The same woman whose signature was scheduled to finalize the most significant merger in the bank's 130-year history. 20 minutes earlier, Ava had stepped out of her midnight blue Tesla Model S at the curb outside the towering glass and steel monument to American banking. The November air in downtown Chicago carried the scent of autumn leaves and the promise of winter. But inside her perfectly climate-controlled car, she had been reviewing the final merger documents on her tablet. The acquisition of Regional First Banking would expand Nova Bank's reach into 14 new states, bringing their total customer base to over 18 million people. She had dressed carefully for this meeting, choosing a charcoal Armani suit that had cost more than most people's monthly salary, paired with Italian leather pumps and a string of pearls that had belonged to her grandmother. Her hair was styled in a sleek bob that framed her face perfectly, and her makeup was flawless. She looked, by any objective measure, like exactly what she was, a successful businesswoman at the height of her powers. The first sign of trouble came when she approached the reception desk in the lobby. The young woman behind the granite counter, her blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun, looked up with the practiced smile of someone trained in customer service. But when her eyes met Ava's, something shifted. The smile became strained, almost forced. "Good morning," Ava had said, setting her briefcase on the counter. "I'm here for an 11:30 appointment with Margaret Whitmore." The receptionist, whose nameplate read Jessica Chen, glanced at her computer screen, then back at Ava. "I'm sorry, but I don't see any appointment scheduled for Ms. Whitmore this morning. Are you sure you have the right branch?" Ava's eyebrows rose slightly. She had personally confirmed this appointment with Margaret's assistant just the day before. "I'm quite certain. This is regarding the Regional First merger. I'm Dr. Ava Langston from Nova Bank." Jessica's fingers clicked across her keyboard with increasing urgency. "I'm not finding anything under that name. Do you have an account with us? I'd need to see some identification to verify your information." The request for identification struck Ava as odd. She wasn't trying to access an account or withdraw money. She was here for a business meeting. But she reached into her purse and pulled out her driver's license, sliding it across the granite surface. Jessica picked up the license, studied it for a long moment, then looked back at Ava with an expression that had shifted from confused to suspicious. "This says your address is in Lincoln Park, but this doesn't really look like you." The words hit Ava like a physical blow. She had heard variations of this sentence throughout her career, usually from people who couldn't reconcile her appearance with her position. "I assure you, that's my current driver's license. Perhaps you could call Ms. Whitmore's office directly." Instead of reaching for the phone, Jessica pressed a button beneath her desk. Within seconds, two uniformed security officers appeared from a side corridor, their hands resting casually on their utility belts. The taller one, Officer Morrison, according to his badge, approached the counter with the confident stride of someone accustomed to authority. "What seems to be the problem here?" Morrison asked, his eyes moving between Jessica and Ava with practiced assessment. Jessica leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. "This woman claims to have an appointment with Ms. Whitmore, but there's nothing on the schedule. She's provided identification, but I'm not convinced it's legitimate. The photo doesn't really match, and she seems confused about our procedures." Morrison nodded gravely, as if Jessica had just reported a matter of national security. He turned to Ava, his expression stern. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step aside so we can verify your identity. Bank security is our top priority." Ava felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach, the same feeling she had experienced countless times throughout her career when her presence in boardrooms and executive offices had been questioned. But this was different. This was supposed to be a routine business meeting, not an interrogation. "Officer Morrison," she said, reading his name tag. "I understand your concern for security, but this is clearly a misunderstanding. If you could simply call Margaret Whitmore's office, I'm sure we could resolve this quickly." Morrison's partner, Patterson, had been studying Ava's driver's license under a small UV light. "This identification appears to be legitimate," he said reluctantly. "But that doesn't necessarily mean she's authorized to be here. We've had issues recently with people using fake or borrowed IDs to gain access to the building." The implication was clear, and Ava felt her professional composure beginning to crack. "Are you suggesting that I'm using someone else's identification? That I'm here under false pretenses?" Morrison held up his hands in a gesture that was meant to be calming, but came across as condescending. "We're not suggesting anything, ma'am. We're simply following protocol. Now, if you could please step over here so we can complete our verification process." What happened next would later be described by witnesses as an escalation that seemed to come from nowhere. Ava, maintaining her professional demeanor, had simply asked to speak with the branch manager or to have someone call her assistant to verify her appointment. It was a reasonable request from someone who clearly belonged in the building. But Morrison and Patterson seemed to interpret her persistence as defiance. Patterson stepped closer, his voice taking on an authoritative edge. "Ma'am, you need to comply with our security procedures. We're going to need you to come with us while we sort this out." "I'm not going anywhere until someone explains to me why I'm being treated like a criminal," Ava replied, her voice steady but with an undercurrent of steel. "I have every right to be here, and I'm not leaving until I've had my scheduled meeting." That was when Morrison made his fatal mistake. Instead of de-escalating the situation, instead of making a simple phone call that would have resolved everything, he reached for his radio and called for backup. "We have a situation in the main lobby. Subject is refusing to comply with security protocols and may need to be removed from the premises." The word "removed" seemed to hang in the air like a physical presence. Other customers in the lobby began to take notice, their conversations trailing off as they turned to watch the unfolding drama. Ava could feel their eyes on her, could sense the mixture of curiosity and judgment in their gazes. "You want to remove me?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. "For what? For having a business meeting, for existing, while black in your precious bank." The words seemed to electrify the space around them. Patterson's face flushed red, and Morrison's jaw tightened. "This has nothing to do with race," Morrison said through gritted teeth. "This is about following security protocols and ensuring the safety of our customers and employees." But even as he spoke, his actions told a different story. He was already moving toward Ava, his hand extended as if to take her arm. "Ma'am, you're going to need to come with us now." Ava stepped back, her briefcase still on the counter. "Don't touch me. I'm not leaving, and I'm certainly not going anywhere with you until someone with actual authority explains what's happening here." That was when Morrison grabbed her arm. The physical contact seemed to flip a switch in both officers. Suddenly, they were no longer bank security dealing with a potential misunderstanding. They were law enforcement officers subduing a suspect. Patterson moved to Ava's other side, taking her other arm, and together they began to guide her forcibly toward the exit. "This is assault," Ava called out, her voice carrying across the marble expanse of the lobby. "You're physically removing me from a public building without cause." But her protests fell on deaf ears. Morrison and Patterson were committed to their course of action now, and they half-dragged, half-carried her toward the revolving doors that led to the street. Her heels scraped against the floor, her briefcase forgotten on the reception counter, her dignity shredded with each step. The other customers in the lobby watched in stunned silence. Some pulled out their phones, recording the scene with the instinctive knowledge that they were witnessing something significant. Others simply stared, their faces reflecting a mixture of shock, confusion, and something else. A recognition that this was not the first time they had seen something like this happen. As they reached the doors, Morrison leaned close to Ava's ear. "You're banned from this premises," he said quietly. "If you try to come back, we'll have you arrested for trespassing. Do you understand?" Ava looked back at him, her eyes blazing with a fury that made him take a step back. "Oh, I understand perfectly," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "The question is, do you understand what you've just done?" And then she was outside, standing on the sidewalk in the November chill, watching through the glass doors as the two officers returned to their posts as if nothing had happened. Behind them, the normal business of the bank continued, customers making deposits, tellers counting money, the quiet hum of commerce carrying on as if a woman hadn't just been physically removed from the building for the crime of being black and successful. Ava stood there for a long moment, letting the cold air cool her burning cheeks, feeling the weight of humiliation settle on her shoulders like a heavy coat. She could walk away. She could go back to her office, reschedule the meeting, pretend this had never happened. It would be easier that way, cleaner. She had built her entire career on being twice as good, twice as professional, twice as accommodating as her white counterparts. She had learned to swallow these indignities and move forward. But not today. Instead, she pulled out her phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. "David, it's Ava. I need you to implement Protocol 7 immediately." David Chen, her chief financial officer and the closest thing she had to a brother, was quiet for a moment. "Are you sure once we trigger that clause, there's no going back?" "I'm sure. And David, make sure the media contacts are ready. This is going to be big." Protocol 7 was something that had been built into every major contract Nova Bank had signed over the past 5 years. It was Ava's insurance policy, a clause that allowed her company to immediately acquire any property or business that violated their civil rights or discrimination policies. It had been drafted by some of the best legal minds in the country and had never been used. Until now. What Morrison and Patterson didn't know, what the bank's management didn't know, was that Nova Bank didn't just lease space in the First Metropolitan Building. They held a series of complex financial instruments that, when combined with the discrimination clause in their lease agreement, gave them the legal right to acquire the entire property under specific circumstances. Circumstances that had just been met. As Ava stood on the sidewalk, her phone pressed to her ear, coordinating with her legal team and her media contacts, she could see Morrison and Patterson through the glass doors. They were talking to each other, probably congratulating themselves on how they had handled the situation. Patterson was even laughing at something Morrison had said. They had no idea that their lives were about to change forever. Within minutes, Ava's phone began buzzing with calls from reporters. The story was already spreading on social media, thanks to the bystanders who had recorded the incident. Banking While Black was trending on Twitter, and the video of her being dragged from the building had been viewed over 1 million times. But the real story, the story that would dominate headlines for weeks to come, was just beginning. Inside the bank, Margaret Whitmore was sitting in her corner office on the 15th floor, reviewing quarterly reports, when her assistant knocked on the door. "Ms. Whitmore, there's been an incident downstairs. Security removed a woman who claimed to have an appointment with you." Margaret looked up from her computer screen, frowning. "What kind of incident? And what appointment? I don't have anything scheduled until this afternoon." Her assistant, a young man named Trevor, shifted uncomfortably. She said she was Dr. Ava Langston from Nova Bank. Something about a regional first merger. The blood drained from Margaret's face. The regional first merger was the most important deal in the bank's history. And Ava Langston was not just any customer, she was the customer. The one whose business relationship with First Metropolitan was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. "Oh my God," Margaret whispered, reaching for her phone. "Trevor, get me Dr. Langston on the line immediately, and find out exactly what happened downstairs." But when Trevor tried to call Nova Bank's offices, he was told that Dr. Langston was unavailable and that all communications should go through the company's legal department. That was when Margaret knew they were in serious trouble. Meanwhile, downstairs in the lobby, Morrison and Patterson were beginning to sense that something was wrong. The first sign was when their supervisor, Captain Rodriguez, appeared at their security station with a grim expression on his face. "I need to see the incident report from this morning," Rodriguez said without preamble. "The one involving the woman you removed from the premises." Morrison handed over the report, which described Ava as a suspicious individual attempting to gain unauthorized access to the building using potentially fraudulent identification. It painted her as belligerent and uncooperative, refusing to follow security protocols. Rodriguez read the report twice, then looked up at his officers with an expression of disbelief. "Do either of you have any idea who you just threw out of this building?" Patterson shrugged. "Some woman trying to scam her way into the building. We've seen it before. They use fake IDs, claim to have appointments, cause a scene when they're caught." "That woman," Rodriguez said slowly, "was Dr. Ava Langston, the founder and CEO of Nova Bank. She's worth more money than this entire building, and she had a legitimate appointment to finalize a merger that would have brought this bank over $2 billion in new business." The silence that followed was deafening. Morrison's face went pale, and Patterson actually took a step backward as if he had been physically struck. "That's impossible," Morrison said weakly. "She didn't look like... she couldn't have been." "She couldn't have been what?" Rodriguez asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "A successful black woman, a CEO, someone who belongs in this building more than you do." Before either officer could respond, Rodriguez's radio crackled to life. "Captain Rodriguez, Please report to the executive floor immediately. We have a situation developing. The situation, as it turned out, was far worse than anyone could have imagined. By the time Rodriguez reached the executive floor, the bank's legal team was already in crisis mode. Phone calls were being made to lawyers, insurance companies, and crisis management firms. The story was spreading across social media like wildfire, and reporters were already gathering outside the building. Margaret Whitmore was in her office, pacing back and forth while her assistant fielded calls from increasingly frantic board members. The bank's stock price had already begun to drop as news of the incident spread, and several major clients were threatening to withdraw their business. But the worst was yet to come. At exactly 2:47 p.m., a process server arrived at the bank's main entrance. He was escorted upstairs by building security, past the same lobby where Ava had been humiliated just hours earlier, to the office of the bank's chief legal counsel. The documents he delivered were comprehensive and devastating. Nova Bank was not just suing for discrimination and civil rights violations. They were exercising their right to acquire the entire First Metropolitan building under the terms of their existing lease agreement. The legal mechanism was brilliant in its simplicity. When Nova Bank had signed their lease 5 years earlier, they had negotiated a clause that allowed them to purchase the building if they were ever subjected to discrimination or civil rights violations on the premises. It was a clause that the bank's lawyers had agreed to because it seemed unlikely to ever be triggered, and because Nova Bank's business was too valuable to lose over what seemed like a minor contractual detail. Now, that minor detail was about to cost the bank everything. The purchase price was fair market value, as determined by an independent appraisal that had been conducted just 6 months earlier as part of the bank's refinancing package. $147 million for a building that the bank had considered their crown jewel, their symbol of stability and permanence in the Chicago financial district. But the legal documents contained another surprise. The acquisition wasn't just authorized by the discrimination clause, it had already been approved by the city's zoning board and the state's banking commission. Every regulatory hurdle had been cleared in advance. Every potential legal challenge had been anticipated and addressed. Nova Bank's legal team had been preparing for this moment for years, hoping they would never need to use it, but ready to act swiftly if they did. As the full scope of the situation became clear, Margaret Whitmore found herself facing the most devastating crisis of her career. The bank's board of directors was demanding answers. Their major clients were threatening to leave, and the media was having a field day with the story of the black CEO who had been thrown out of her own building. But perhaps the most bitter irony was that the very merger Ava had come to finalize, the Regional First acquisition that would have made First Metropolitan one of the largest banks in the Midwest, was now in jeopardy. Regional First's executives were reconsidering the deal, unwilling to be associated with a bank that had made such a public and devastating mistake. Meanwhile, Ava was in her office 42 floors above, watching the chaos unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. She had never wanted it to come to this. All she had wanted was to be treated with the basic respect that any other CEO would have received. Instead, she had been humiliated, physically removed from a building where she was supposed to be welcomed as a valued partner. Now, she owned that building. The acquisition was completed with breathtaking speed. By 4 p.m., less than 5 hours after she had been dragged from the lobby, Ava Langston was the sole owner of the First Metropolitan building. The bank would continue to operate as a tenant, paying rent to the woman they had ejected from their premises. But Ava wasn't finished. The next morning, she called a press conference in the very lobby where she had been humiliated. The marble floors had been polished to a brilliant shine, and the morning light streaming through the glass doors created an almost ethereal atmosphere. Representatives from every major news outlet in the city were present, their cameras and microphones creating a forest of technology in the usually quiet space. Ava stood at a podium that had been placed near the reception desk, the same spot where Jessica Chen had questioned her identification. She was wearing another perfectly tailored suit, this one in navy blue, and her bearing was regal, commanding. This was her building now, and everyone in it, from the security guards to the bank executives, was her tenant. "Yesterday morning," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the packed lobby, "I came to this building for a routine business meeting. I was dressed professionally. I had proper identification, and I had every right to be here. Instead, I was treated like a criminal, physically removed from the premises, and banned from returning." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "The officers who removed me made assumptions about who I was and what I was doing here, based on nothing more than the color of my skin. They saw a black woman in a business suit and assumed she didn't belong. They were wrong." The crowd of reporters was silent, hanging on every word. "Today, I am the owner of this building. Every person who works here, every business that operates here, does so as my tenant. But I didn't acquire this property for revenge. I acquired it to make a point." She gestured toward the marble walls and soaring ceiling. "This building will be renamed the Equality Tower. It will serve as a reminder that discrimination has consequences, that dignity has value, and that justice, while sometimes delayed, is never denied." The questions from reporters came rapid fire. What would happen to First Metropolitan? Would she be firing employees? What were her plans for the building? Ava answered each question with grace and precision. The bank would continue to operate normally. She explained. No employees would be fired because of the change in ownership. The building would continue to serve the community as it always had. But there would be changes. "Effective immediately," she announced. "This building will implement the most comprehensive anti-discrimination policies in the financial district. Every employee, every security officer, every person who works in this building will undergo sensitivity training. We will create an environment where everyone, regardless of race, gender, religion, or background, is treated with dignity and respect." She looked directly at the security station where Morrison and Patterson would normally be standing. They were notably absent, having been suspended pending a full investigation into the incident. "The officers who removed me yesterday will face the consequences of their actions. They will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law for assault, violation of civil rights, and abuse of authority. Their actions not only hurt me personally, they cost their employer millions of dollars and damage the reputation of every business in this building." The press conference continued for another hour, with Ava fielding questions about everything from her business philosophy to her plans for the future. Throughout it all, she maintained her composure, her dignity, her sense of purpose. When it was over, as the reporters packed up their equipment and the crowd began to disperse, Margaret Whitmore approached the podium. She looked older than she had the day before, worn down by the stress and embarrassment of the situation. "Dr. Langston," she said quietly, "I want to apologize. What happened to you was inexcusable, and I take full responsibility for the actions of our security team." Ava studied the other woman's face, seeing genuine remorse there. "Margaret, I appreciate your apology, but apologies don't change what happened. Actions do. The question is, what are you going to do to make sure this never happens again?" Margaret nodded. "Whatever it takes. I've already implemented new policies, new training programs. We're reviewing every aspect of our security procedures. This will never happen again." "I hope not," Ava replied, "because now I'll be watching." In the days that followed, the story of Ava Langston and the Equality Tower became a symbol of empowerment and justice. The video of her being dragged from the building had been viewed millions of times, sparking conversations about discrimination, privilege, and the power of consequences. Morrison and Patterson were indeed prosecuted, facing charges of assault, civil rights violations, and abuse of authority. They were convicted and sentenced to community service and mandatory sensitivity training. Their careers in security effectively over. The HOA that had contracted their services was also held liable, forced to pay substantial damages and implement comprehensive reforms to their hiring and training practices. But perhaps the most significant change was in the building itself. The Equality Tower, as it came to be known, became a model for inclusive business practices. Companies from around the country sent representatives to study its policies and procedures, hoping to implement similar programs in their own organizations. The building's lobby was transformed into a gallery celebrating diversity and achievement, featuring portraits and stories of successful people from all backgrounds. Where once there had been sterile marble and corporate logos, now there were faces that reflected the true diversity of American success. Ava's own portrait hung near the entrance, not as a monument to her wealth or power, but as a reminder of the importance of dignity and respect. Below it, a plaque read, "Justice delayed is justice denied, but justice achieved is justice for all." The Regional First merger, which had been the original reason for Ava's visit to the bank, was eventually completed, but under very different circumstances. Regional First's executives, impressed by Ava's handling of the situation and her commitment to equality, insisted that the new partnership include comprehensive diversity and inclusion initiatives. First Metropolitan, chastened by the experience and determined to rebuild their reputation, embraced these initiatives wholeheartedly. The bank that had once been known for its exclusivity became a leader in inclusive banking, serving communities that had been historically underserved by traditional financial institutions. Years later, as Ava stood in the lobby of the Equality Tower, watching the daily flow of people going about their business, she reflected on how a single moment of discrimination had transformed not just her own life, but the lives of everyone who worked in or visited the building. The security guards who now worked in the lobby were a diverse group, trained not just in security procedures, but in cultural sensitivity and conflict resolution. They greeted every visitor with respect, regardless of their appearance or background. The bank tellers and customer service representatives had undergone extensive training in unconscious bias and cultural competency. They served customers with professionalism and courtesy, understanding that every person who walked through the doors deserved to be treated with dignity. The executives and managers in the building's upper floors had implemented policies that promoted diversity at every level of their organizations. They understood that inclusion wasn't just morally right, it was good business. But perhaps most importantly, the building had become a symbol of hope for others who had faced similar discrimination. People from around the country visited the Equality Tower, drawing inspiration from Ava's story and finding the courage to fight their own battles against prejudice and injustice. The transformation wasn't complete overnight, and it wasn't without challenges. There were those who resented the changes, who longed for the old ways of doing business, but they were outnumbered by those who embraced the new culture of inclusion and respect. Ava had learned that true change required more than just policies and procedures. It required a fundamental shift in how people thought about others who were different from themselves. It required empathy, understanding, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about bias and privilege. The Equality Tower stood as proof that such change was possible, that one person's courage to stand up against injustice could create ripples that spread far beyond their own experience. as the sun set behind the Chicago skyline, casting long shadows across the marble floors of the lobby. Ava smiled. She had come to this building as a customer, been treated as a criminal, and left as an owner. But more than that, she had transformed a place of exclusion into a beacon of inclusion. The building that had once rejected her now bore her vision of equality and justice. And in that transformation, she had found something more valuable than any business deal or financial acquisition. She had found proof that dignity and respect could not be bought or sold, but they could be demanded, and when necessary, taken. The Equality Tower stood tall against the evening sky, its lights twinkling like stars, a monument to the power of standing up for what is right, even when, especially when it seems impossible to win.